Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto. Welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. My mental health tip for today has to do with dealing with transitions. Let me start with a quote. Transition periods are great times to look at what you have, determine what you no longer need, and let go of the clutter. You know, a lot of people go through transitions, and in some cases it throws them for a loop. You know, they thought things were going to continue flowing in a certain way, and then boom, something happens that forces them to adjust. And actually, it doesn't just have to be unexpected transitions. You know, changes that people knew would happen sooner or later can be just as difficult to deal with. And of course, some people do a better job dealing with transitions than others. Well, one way of dealing with transitions is to reframe them by thinking about them as opportunities. Like, well, here I am. This is a lot different from what I'm used to, but maybe I can learn something new, or maybe I'll experience something that I've never had the chance to before. So basically, your outlook on things can obviously make a big difference in how well you adjust to transitions. So keep that in mind as you plod along in life. Okay, my guest today is Diann Wingert, who's actually going to be talking about transitions of midlife women. And I think you'll really like this interview. Here's Diann. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Thanks for joining us. Today, I am joined by Diann Wingert, who is a licensed clinical social worker in Pasadena, California, who works with women in midlife transition, among other things. And Diann, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chris, for having me.
Thanks. Well, why don't you share with the mental note takers a little bit more about who you are and the type of work that you do, Diann?
Thanks, Chris. Well, as you mentioned, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have been in private practice for almost 6 years.
All right.
But I've been in the field for about 20. It was a second career for me, so I came a little late to the party, entering the field in the mid-90s when I was in my mid-30s.
Oh, okay.
So I'm in private practice now, but I've worked in a variety of settings prior to that.
So what made you want to go into this field, Diann? Why don't you share with us a little bit about your story, how you got involved in this field?
I'd be happy to. You know, Chris, I have a philosophy that no one ends up in a helping profession by accident. I believe that we are drawn to the helping profession and specifically to the mental health helping profession, generally speaking, because of our own personal stories.
All right.
So because it was a second career for me, it wasn't the direction I was originally headed, but I felt very much drawn to it after experiencing kind of a life-changing car accident that prevented me from continuing in the field I was in. And it gave me a lot of time to think about my life, my future, why I'm still here, and what I can really do to benefit others. So I started off originally, while I was still recovering from the accident, doing some volunteer work in a local family service agency. And they put me in a program that was serving women and children exposed to domestic violence.
Okay.
And I really fell in love with it. I fell in love with the clients and the opportunity to help. And I just decided I'm going to change my life. I'm going to go back to graduate school and I'm going to become a clinical social worker. So I think the reason why it was so appealing to me is because, like so many people, I identify with the expression dysfunctional family as it applies to my own family growing up.
Uh-huh.
So I think being someone who was exposed to a lot of drama and trauma in early life not only gave me the ability to tolerate other people's suffering, but because I survived it as well as I did, I also almost felt obligated to help others who were not coping so well as I did.
Wow, that's quite a story. Well, you know, that's interesting because I mentioned this a lot on my podcast where my guest, when I asked them this question about why did they go into the field, a lot of them share similar experiences to you, that something either from their background, their childhood, or in your case, you were in this car accident. A couple of podcasts ago, I had a guest, Matt Boone, who was talking about how he had an issue where he lost use of his hands, and he had to go through a lot of similar, medical procedures, and a lot of time passed for him, and he had to decide for himself, well, what am I going to do? And through his own experiences, he learned how to use meditation and mindfulness to kind of help him through his own experiences, to try to get him through that. And as a result of that, he made a decision to go into the helping field because it was such a powerful experience for him. So it's a really interesting thing, isn't it? How past experiences like this have an impact on career choices.
Very much so. And I'll tell you something else. I think because a number of my siblings really did not fare so well in our family of origin environment as I did. I think when I grew up and left home and went to college and moved on with my life, I think in a way, looking back now, I almost feel that I thought I'd made a clean getaway and I would just keep going. But after having this car accident, which there was no reason to believe that I would actually survive, and I did. It really was almost a spiritual reawakening, Chris. And I thought, there's a reason why you're still here. Yeah. And my former career was in medical sales, so my thinking was, there's a reason why you're still here, Diann, and I'm pretty sure it's not to increase the market share for the pharmaceutical company that you're working for. Uh-huh. And it really gave me an opportunity to use my resiliency in a way that didn't just benefit me, but benefited others. And going forward in my career as a clinical social worker, I became eventually a field instructor and a clinical supervisor and a program manager, and I was responsible for mentoring and guiding and supervising both graduate student interns and unlicensed professionals. Okay. So as I would interview different people to determine who was going to be accepted into the internship or who I would personally supervise, one of the very first questions I asked every single person was, why are you here? And of course they would say, for an interview. And I say, no, not that. Why are you in this field? And I was always looking for kind of an origin story, not necessarily a story like mine, but I always found the most fascinating reasons. And that really eventually led me to the conclusion that no one gets here by mistake, that we are in a way called to this work.
Well, speaking of origins, you mentioned a little bit about your family of origin, and I wonder if those types of experiences contributed to your decision to go into the social work field as opposed to the counseling or psychology, as a graduate program. What prompted you to go the social work route?
That's a really good question. Mm-hmm. At the time that I was contemplating my options, as I mentioned, I was in my mid-30s, I was married, I had 3 kids in grade school and middle school, and I looked at the different options. Because I'm licensed in the state of California, we do not have licensed professional counselors. Mm-hmm. So there was the marriage and family therapist track. At that time, it was called the marriage, family, child counselor track. It's now MFT. There was the LCSW track, and then there was the PhD track. There weren't too many people going the PsyD route. So at that point in time, based on the ages of my kids and the length of the commitment to become a psychologist, even though I was inclined to go that direction, I thought 7 years is just too much. Schooling for my family, it's too many years without my income. And then the MFT track didn't really speak to me because I didn't want to be a marriage counselor or necessarily work with children. Right. I liked the MSW, LCSW track because from my study of it at the time, it seemed the most comprehensive. And my personal belief was that there are so many factors that influence an individual that the more you can take into account, the more likely you are to help them.
Yeah. Isn't it true? And this is what I really respect about the social work field is I think the philosophy is to look at things, to look at the person within context, within environment. And there are broader environmental things that can impact behavior and mental functioning. And I really appreciate that aspect of the social work field. And, as you've worked with clients, and I guess what I'd like to find out, perhaps as a starting point, is what kind of clients that you work with, and what types of issues or themes have you found that these clients come in with that see you?
Well, I've had a long career by this point, and I've had the good fortune to work in a variety of settings. Over the course of the first 18 years in the field, I every few years moved between a child-centered environment and an adult-centered environment, and between a mental health environment and a medical environment. So over those 18 years, I worked with children, teens, adults, couples, families who had mental health issues, who had medical problems, and everything in between. And by the time I ended up in my private practice, when I first started out, I had had so much experience in so many environments that I kind of opened a general practice. The first year, I think my youngest client was 6 and my oldest was 86.
Wow.
And I thought, it was fun. I'm a very agile, nimble person, and it was exciting to have so many different clients with so many different issues and developmental stages. But I realized you really can't set up an office to meet everyone where they're at when the span is so great. So over time, I started eliminating groups that I realized I'm not really gifted with, and I don't really want to do the extra training to become gifted with. And I eventually, I guess you could say, niched down to the point where in the last couple of years, my practice is focused exclusively on working with women at midlife who are dealing with all the changes that come with this age and stage, and want to be able to handle those changes better and move forward with confidence.
What made you decide to work with women in midlife transition, Diann?
I think the primary reason is because I have gone through this myself. I turned 60 this year. And the year I turned 40, it was a very disruptive experience for me. I guess looking back, I perhaps had a bit of a midlife crisis and spent my 40s, really making a lot of changes in my life. And not all of them turned out the way that I had wanted or expected them to. And looking backwards, I gained some perspective and learned, as it turns out, this is a very tumultuous time in the lives of many, many women. In fact, if you're familiar with the research out of the University of Pennsylvania in positive psychology, there's something called the happiness U-curve. And it refers to the fact that people are generally happier in their 20s and 30s, and once they hit their 40s, they kind of bottom out in a way and don't start getting happier again until close to 60. So I became fascinated with that. It did resonate with my own life experience, and I was determined to help that group of people feel better and function better. And it aligned so well with my own life experience that it's been a very fulfilling place for me to work.
Wow. So once again, it's those personal life experiences that come into play in affecting what we do as professionals, either, actually as for career choice, to begin with, I guess, and then perhaps as we go along as professionals, those personal experiences continue to have an impact. And so with these women, what types of issues are you discussing with them, or what kinds of issues do they have that they're seeking help for?
Generally speaking, my midlife clients come in with the same type of complaints that other people do at different stages of life. They will be experiencing anxiety, they'll be experiencing depression, sometimes they are having marital difficulties, sometimes there's conflict with other family members, they may be dissatisfied in their career. There could be any number of things. What I think is so fascinating about this time of life is that women are going through so much change biologically at this time. And unbeknownst to most of them, it is definitely influencing how they feel about every aspect of their life.
Okay.
And so just recognizing a lot of women are coming in because they're having issues that they think are related to their empty nest, or they think are related to their no longer feeling fulfilled in their career, wanting to change careers, wanting to do something different, go back to school, go to graduate school, maybe become a therapist. They're not happy with the changes that are happening in their face and body as a result of aging. They might have issues related to grief and loss because their parents are aging and passing on. Maybe their adult children aren't launching successfully. And I think there's a significant number of women at midlife who have been in a long-term marriage that has been functioning relatively well.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly the woman feels like, I don't think I want to be here anymore, or I don't know if I want to be here anymore. Or a number of them have been quietly biding their time, waiting for the youngest child to leave home. And when that happens, they take their leave as well. I became sort of fascinated in this phenomenon because it's happening with such frequency that there's actually a term for it, which is now called gray divorce.
Huh.
Turns out that the only group demographically in terms of age that is increasing the divorce statistics at this time are couples over 50. In every other age group, it's on the decline. So I see a lot of that. Yeah.
Well, you hear, and maybe this is because of my lack of education in the area of divorce, that, toward this time of life, that it would be the husband that would be the one that would typically be the one that leaves the relationship. But from what you're describing, maybe that's not so. Maybe it's not as atypical for women to leave the relationships either.
You know what I've been learning, Chris, is that you're familiar, I'm sure, with the term midlife crisis.
Yeah.
And it was first coined in the mid-'60s and, was spoken of quite a bit by Carl Jung, and many psychologists are familiar with this. I gave a presentation to a room full of mental health professionals with a psychological society I'm a member of called The Myth of the Midlife Crisis. And I actually showed a lot of context through media where there are just a number of popular films where a man in midlife crisis is featured. But there were no such films about women.
Huh.
And what turns out to be the case, and this is an area of ongoing interest and research for me as I'm trying to make sense of it so that I can help my clients in the best way possible. I believe that the classic midlife crisis, as we think of it, where the man runs off with a secretary half his wife's age and gets a sports car and maybe grows a ponytail even though he has a balding head. And, it's sort of a cultural stereotype.
Yeah.
I think that probably did account for more of the midlife divorce statistics in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s.
Uh-huh.
But my generation, baby boomers, we were the first generation of women to go into the workforce in record numbers, even though most of us were also married and had children at home. So I think the reason why, and I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe the current statistics on midlife divorce are that a significant majority, maybe even as much as 2/3, are initiated by women. And the primary reason for that is that more women in that age group are baby boomers, and they have the financial wherewithal to imagine living separately. In the past, when this term was first coined, women, generally speaking, did not have that ability.
Wow. So when you look at and you talk to these women who are in this situation, what are some of the reasons that they give you for wanting to leave a relationship, or maybe questioning the relationship, or how good it is, or whether they want to stay in it? What are some of the reasons they offer for their, I guess, general dissatisfaction with the relationship?
I think that it's human nature to want to change our circumstances when we feel unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the only option, but it seems to be the most popular one. Yeah. And so when a person is unhappy, dissatisfied, unfulfilled, they generally look to different aspects of their life and contemplate, how would I feel if I made this change? And I personally believe that all human behavior is driven by how we think it will make us feel.
All right.
So many women got married, had children, purchased certain items, houses, cars, and so forth. And not just women, but men too.
Uh-huh.
But the decisions that most of us made that create the framework of our life were made in the mindset of a woman, typically in her 20s, perhaps her early 30s. And I'm speaking of decisions like, what will my occupation or profession or career path be?
Uh-huh.
Will I get married? And if so, to who? Will I have children? And if so, how many? Where will we live? What will our lifestyle be? All those really important decisions are made at an age and stage when really our personality and our self-awareness and our understanding of who we are and what we need is still forming. But those are the stages that we tend to make those decisions. Well, then in your 20s, maybe you're making those decisions, and in your 30s, you're executing those decisions, and you're building a life around those decisions. You're developing your career, you're developing your family, you're developing your lifestyle around that framework of those choices. Well, fast forward to mid 40s to mid 50s, you've now been living in the life that you constructed around those decisions. And it's partly because of the biological changes to the body, mind, and brain that are triggered by the hormonal shifts at this stage. But there are other reasons too. And when this occurs, many women have the sometimes gradual and sometimes sudden feeling that I don't know if I want all this anymore. And I will say the year I turned 40, it was almost like happy birthday. I don't want this life anymore. It was really, really quite sudden. And I felt, wow, the thought I actually had, Chris, was, wow, my life is half over. Is this how I want it to be?
Wow.
And it was kind of shocking, but I think that can happen to a lot of women. It does seem to happen to a lot of women. And so when you have that feeling, if you don't understand where it's coming from and how to work through it, which is the nature of the work I do now, you may think that what you need to do to feel better is to unmake one of those choices. And it's either the career or the marriage or both that tend to be up for review and questioning. And I think that is probably more than anything else kind of the trigger, especially if a woman thinks, if she got married because she thought that would make her happy, it would be natural for her to think if she's not happy, then she should get unmarried. That'll fix it.
Yeah.
I think it's very sad. I am not pro-divorce and I am not against divorce. What I am is for what I call the informed consent that should guide that decision.
Okay.
And I don't think a lot of people that are pulling the plug these days really understand the long-term consequences. I opted to divorce and break up a 15-year marriage within the context of my own midlife crisis. And while I don't regret that decision per se, there's so much that I understand now about the long-term consequences of that choice that it would have really helped me to know then.
That's a really good point, because as you were talking about that, I was thinking, if a woman has this happen to her where she has this overwhelming, not overwhelming feeling, but maybe a sudden feeling, like in your case, I'm turning 40 and half my life is over. I imagine that for some women, they might feel panicky or anxious. And of course, some people, when they feel that way, want to act on that, do something about that so they don't feel the anxiety anymore. And what I hear you saying is that maybe hold off on doing anything, not necessarily act on those feelings quickly, but kind of think through, okay, what's happening to me and what are some options for me and what are the long-term consequences as part of this informed consent.
Absolutely. I think not being able to tolerate our own emotions is a huge reason behind what later proved themselves to be regrettable choices.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I do with my clients is really try to slow down the process of making decisions and try to anchor them around some of the core exercises I do are, teach them about the happiness U curve, share with them what's going on in their body, mind, and brain as a result of the hormonal changes of perimenopause and menopause, work with them on stress management, which includes mindfulness, meditation, and some other things like that. And also I do life balance exercises and core values exercises because typically speaking, if we have the feeling that we've ended up in a life that no longer suits us, and I've had some of my clients say, what am I doing in some other woman's life?
Yeah.
Then you really have to be able to anchor yourself in a knowledge of who you are, what you need, what you want, where you want your life to head, what's important to you now, and to have the skills and the mindset to be able to handle stress and to manage your own mind so that anxiety doesn't drive you to premature changes that might not work out so well for you in the long run.
I bet it's hard for some of them to do that, though, isn't it? For some of them to take the time just to slow down and to learn some of these exercises and some of the things that you suggest, because they want an instant decision, or they want something to happen now. And for you to tell them, let's take things a little bit slower, that's got to be hard for some of those women, huh?
It truly is. And I will also tell you, Chris, that about a year ago, I became certified as a life coach. And so I now offer, really for my therapy clients, a combination of counseling and coaching. And I also have a coaching practice that I do online, strictly for coaching, that's got nothing to do with therapy.
Okay.
And one of the tools that I learned in my coaching curriculum was a self-coaching tool that takes a person through a process by which they come to an understanding that changing the circumstances in their life is not necessarily going to change the way they feel, but changing their thoughts about their circumstances will definitely change the way they feel. So being able to know that you've heard the expression, I'm sure, change your thoughts, change your life.
Yeah.
Well, it actually turns out to be true. So in this example, if a woman is thinking, I don't love my husband anymore, right? So I don't love my husband anymore. She's going to feel angsty. She's going to feel desperate. She's going to feel unsettled. She's going to feel discontent.
Yeah.
And so those feelings are going to drive actions, which may be anything from filing for divorce, having an affair, disconnecting from him emotionally, spending a lot of time away from home, at work, with friends, and so forth. As long as she's thinking that thought, it will be driving her in the direction of a marital breakdown. If she could shift that thought to, I'm not sure how I feel about my husband, it's not a huge leap, but it does tend to lead to a different sort of emotion, which is maybe questioning.
Right.
And from there, I have a better chance of teaching her some other tools to slow down the process and get more familiar with what's really going on in her mind so that she can make better decisions that she can actually live with.
So you look at all this work that you're doing with these women, and I'm curious. I always like to talk to my guest about what they do, what they see as the recipe for success to get a client to move from point A when they're first coming in to see you to point B when they're ready to kind of launch out on their own and they're done with therapy. And, what are some of the key things that you do that you think is most helpful to get these women to move from point A to point B?
The first thing, I think, in any effective counseling or therapy is, and I learned this on my very first day of social work school, start where the client is at. So allowing the client to just tell their story. Now, I can be very tempted, even in the first session, to want to steer them away from that story, but I don't, because they need to tell it. They need to be heard. They need to be understood. Even though I may believe that the story that they're telling is obviously causing them tremendous suffering,
Yeah.
I will allow them to tell it. And it may require a few sessions to let them tell it.
Mm-hmm.
But fairly quickly after that, I will want to move them towards identifying what the major sources of stress are in their life. And usually they think it's someone else.
Uh-huh.
Someone else's behavior. They think it's their circumstances. So they'll tell me it's their marriage, it's their lousy boss, it's their ungrateful kids, it's their needy mother, it's, whatever. Usually it's another person. Usually it's a relationship or their circumstances. And, they don't like the house they're living in,
right,
or, whatever. And then I will guide them towards an understanding of what choices they have in their life now that they are reviewing and maybe wanting to change, and how they think they got there. So we do a little bit of a life review and figure out, all right, so who were you when you made these choices?
Right.
And why did you make them? What were you hoping for? And why do you think it hasn't turned out the way that you wanted it to? So there's a lot of self-awareness and self-reflection. I'm constantly introducing tools and techniques to build up a woman's stress tolerance.
Okay.
And I'm also and that may be everything. I have a number of visualization techniques. I have my clients journal. I have them do affirmations. I have them do meditation. Of course, I can't necessarily require anyone to do all of these things.
Right.
But some clients, in fact, a lot of clients are really these days not so much interested in insight, particularly the women who come in and are the overworked, overwhelmed variety.
Right.
They will say, I just need some tricks and tips. I just need some tools and strategies. And they don't really want to do the self-awareness work. So I'll give them the tools and tricks. And inevitably, we both discover pretty quickly that those things aren't working. And the reason why they're not working is because they're unable to do them because they haven't addressed the story that they're telling themselves about why they're so stressed out. So we kind of work back around to that. I am the kind of therapist who says it's not just talk, but tools. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I know that just tools without really processing where they are and what's going on inside their head, it's not going to get them very far. It's really just a bit of a Band-Aid.
Yeah. So you really, you allow them the freedom, is from what you're telling me, to kind of make decisions on how they want therapy to proceed. But they'll eventually come to the realization that, you know what, even though I've learned some of these tools, some of these things, it's not happening. It's not working for me. What's going wrong? And so for them to kind of come to that realization themselves and to make a decision if they choose to do a little bit more work, perhaps around the area of insight and those types of things that provide more of a context for what's going on.
And I think after this amount of time in the field, I'm known to be a very intuitive clinician. So I will typically ask my client every few sessions, how do they think the work is going?
Yeah.
How is it meeting their needs? How is it not meeting their needs? I'm very active in seeking out that kind of feedback because I wouldn't want a client to think they couldn't say, you know what, this isn't really helping. I don't really find this useful, or this isn't what I thought it was going to be. I will regularly be inviting that feedback so that I can really help them in the way that they are most receptive to being helped.
Well, that's great. And I think the research shows that that's critical to positive treatment outcome, is to continually assess or to find out, to check in with clients how things are going, to make sure they're getting what they want out of this. And that makes total sense to me. And the other thing, Diann, that I've been hearing you say, and this is more of a kind of an underlying thing, kind of characteristic of your style, you seem to have to put development or developmental stages into the work that you do as well, because I think I heard you say that the person they were when they were in their 20s or 30s may not be necessarily the same as they are in their 40s or 50s, or what they thought would happen as they went through life. Those things change over the course of time. And I think that that's another element that you try to incorporate into your work with clients too, huh?
That's very insightful, Chris. Yes, I think that I use a great deal of understanding about developmental stages in my work because I've been through much of life already myself. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you had asked me earlier why I chose to work with women at midlife. And
yeah.
Obviously my own story is a part of that. But I think in a way I've earned the right to work with women at midlife because I have traveled the road they're on. Mm-hmm. I don't know many. In fact, the majority of my clients have said to me, I'm so glad that you're a peer. I would never dream of seeing a man about these issues or a younger woman.
Yeah.
And so while I could work with anybody from 6 to 86, as I once did, I really feel what's most beneficial to working with women in this season of their life is that I am a peer. And, it's also sort of affected the way I do therapy in another way as I'm thinking about it. I was classically trained at the University of California, Los Angeles, and did most of my training in the Neuropsych Institute there. At that point in time, I really very strongly held to the notion that the therapist really doesn't disclose much, if anything, about their personal life.
Uh-huh.
We wouldn't have any family photos on our desk. We would never make references to anything like our marital status or our background. And I've loosened up on that somewhat over mm-hmm. time because what I've learned, especially working with women in this stage of life, is that they benefit from knowing just a little bit about me so that they know that I really get it and I'm not just book smart or know these things because of the number of clients that I've seen. It creates so much credibility and trust very, very early on in the relationship. And obviously, the sooner there's credibility and trust, the sooner the work in earnest can begin.
Yeah, it really works to their advantage, doesn't it? I mean, when you look at it in that way, I think it really works to their advantage. And I agree that I think that self-disclosure that's used in a way that's where there's a good rationale, a good reason for doing that, and to share just enough where you think that it's going to make an impact on the working alliance or what's happening, whatever issues that you're working on with clients. I think in those situations it makes total sense.
And I think it's something also developmentally that I came to, Chris, because, while I did go into the therapy field in my 30s, I was not yet at a place in my own life where I felt comfortable having clients know anything about me. And I think part of the aging process, as I've experienced it, is that you become more and more of who you really are, and you become more accepting of who you really are. Now, I haven't mentioned this previously, but I have had quite a bit of therapy myself, and I actually still work with a therapist every week. And I think that enables me to not only work clean, which means I'm constantly cleaning my instrument, so I don't have problems with countertransference and so forth. But also, I just think it's good practice to be doing and requiring of yourself what you are asking your clients to do. I think it creates the most transformational kind of work.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And in fact, that's something that we really stress with our students. Is to go out there and get some counseling, find out what it's like, find out about yourself, to learn about yourself. And because, you're bringing yourself into those therapy sessions with your clients, and you need to know what issues may be arising that you don't want to. You don't want them to come into the sessions, but you wouldn't know that unless you develop that self-awareness that comes about with your own personal therapy.
Without question.
Yeah. Well, in your work with these clients, Diann, what do you find to be the most challenging aspects. What things have really not necessarily thrown you for a loop, but have really presented challenges for you as a therapist in your work with these women?
I have gotten better and better over time at choosing the clients that I can help. When I first started in private practice, I really would see anybody who would pay me. The first few months, I was on insurance panels, and I shared an office with someone that was just really not suited to being in a small group practice. And so I broke away from that and decided I would have a fee-for-service practice. And as you know, that can be quite challenging. Yeah. So I really would see anybody that was willing to see me. And over time, as I developed my practice and my reputation in the local community, gradually over the years, I was able to be more selective. And I finally reached a point where I realized, okay, these are my people. These are the clients that I am uniquely qualified and called to serve. Uh-huh. But not every woman at midlife is an ideal client for me just because she happens to be at this age and stage. So right. When I do my initial assessment, whether it's for a coaching client or a counseling client, I really am most interested in figuring out how open she is to change. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a major determining factor. I think when I first went into the field, Chris, I was naive enough to believe that anyone who was in enough pain was willing to change. Yeah. It's not actually true. I think the clients, I don't have any of them anymore because I think I've become really good at my initial assessment. Uh-huh. And if I don't think this is a person I can help, or frankly who will allow me to help them, I will send them on to someone else. And what I mean by allow me to help them is occasionally, and I'm sure you've experienced this in your own career, you will try working with a client who is in an enormous amount of emotional pain. Uh-huh. And yet, no matter what you attempt to do, how you attempt to teach them cognitive behavioral skills or meditate, any skill, you whip out every tool in your toolkit, you try every strategy, and none of them work. And, for young therapists, because I know a number of your podcast listeners are early stage mental health practitioners and graduate students, uh-huh. They will no doubt experience this, if they haven't already, where you are literally knocking yourself out trying to help this person, yeah. And seemingly nothing works. And yeah. Early on in your career, you will blame yourself. You will shame yourself in your own self-talk and think, what am I doing wrong? You'll talk to your supervisor, you'll talk to your colleagues, and you'll try even harder. I have learned over the many years I've been in this field that there are people who are extremely attached to their suffering, mm-hmm. and to the story that supports it. And it's not that I don't care about these people, it's that I don't think they are at the right place for us to work together because they are not in a position where they will allow me to help them. And I don't want to take anybody's time or money if healthy, sustainable change is not possible at that time.
Well, that makes total sense. And actually, what you're really talking about here is that whole model of the stages of change. And where is a client in the stages of change? And of course, if they are at a point where they're not even contemplating, or if they have contemplated, but they're still, it's going to be too much work, then really how much success is going to come out of doing any kind of therapy with them?
I agree. And I just simply, of course, I want to have my experiences with clients be satisfying for both of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
that's good.
Yeah.
Good point. Well, Diann, at this last stage of this interview, where I call this Make a Mental Note, and it's where I like to ask guests about tips or words of wisdom that they could share with the audience, regardless if the audience is this general audience members wanting to learn a little bit more about mental health issues, or like you said, the students that listen to this or the mental health professionals, do you have any words of wisdom or tips that you could provide just to kind of enhance a person's mental health?
Absolutely. I think many of us know that going to a counselor or therapist will lead to better mental health. And for people who need medication, psychotropic medication, they know that that can make a difference too. But what I think many people are not aware of, and sadly, even many therapists are not aware of, is just how much benefit to our mental health comes from some really good basic lifestyle habits. And I'm speaking of what I call the pillars of health, which are good nutrition, adequate hydration, movement of some kind. I steer away from the word exercise because it's a naughty word for so many people. But we need to move our bodies, people. We really do. And we need to get enough sleep. And we also need to do things that bring us joy. I also personally think that most people need some kind of a spiritual path, however they define it. And it is pretty amazing just how much benefit you can get from what I call the habits of mental wellness. And how much, there's so much good information that's coming out now about the gut-brain connection and how healthy eating habits can improve our mental health through feeding our gut. Everybody knows that there are serotonin, well, not everybody maybe, but there are serotonin receptors in the brain, and many of the popular antidepressants increase the amount of serotonin that's circulating in the brain. But what they may not know is there are more serotonin receptors in the lining of our guts than there are in our brain.
Interesting.
So what we eat and put into our body makes a huge difference in our mental health. So if they want to make some changes in their life that may not even require seeing a counselor or taking medication, getting some good information about what a healthy diet is, how much water they need on a regular basis, how much exercise they need, how much sleep they need, and how to bring joy in their life and have some sort of spiritual path. There's so much you can do to enhance your mental wellness through those healthy habits.
Oh, that's great advice. Well, Diann, if a potential client is interested in contacting you for therapy, how might they get an appointment with you? How might they contact you?
Okay, well, because I'm licensed as a clinical social worker in the state of California, I can only work with therapy clients who are in the state of California. However, in my coaching practice, which I focus on the same population and use a lot of tools. And I do a 20-minute consultation to determine if this person is appropriate for coaching. And if they're not, and they're not in the state of California, obviously wouldn't be able to see them. But they can contact me through my website at www.diannwingert.com. And I'm sure you'll have that spelled out in the show notes.
I sure will. I'll have all that information in there. And I really appreciate you being a part of this podcast today. I think that we've talked about some really interesting things. And, we haven't really focused much in this podcast series about women in midlife. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking about not only your experiences in working with these women, but why you got into the field to begin with based on your own personal experiences. So thanks again for being part of this, Diann.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Chris. I hope that it was valuable to your clients, and I enjoyed it too.
Okay. All right. That was a great interview with Diann. And, as I was thinking about, what was the takeaway, the mental notes takeaway from this interview? There's certainly a lot of them. But one of the things I think that Diann was talking about is when women change the way they think about various circumstances in their lives, it helps them change the way they feel. And you know what? It gets back to what I was saying in my introduction to the podcast in terms of reframing transitions as opportunities. Now, here's my question for you for today. What are some of the ways this notion of informed consent can guide women's decisions? And so this isn't informed consent necessarily in terms of the clinical sense, like therapists think about it. But what Diann mentioned is that women should think through decisions and not allow their feelings to dictate what they do. So slowing down the process of making decisions and anchoring them around what she called that happiness U-curve, and understanding how biological changes that occur in midlife, they affect decisions, and trying to identify, she said, core values. All of these things are part of making well-informed decisions at times of transition and moving forward in life. Well, please visit my website, chrisquarto.com, to get the show notes for this episode. And actually, you can listen to past episodes of the podcast there as well. Or an easier thing to do is to subscribe to the podcast by using an app. My personal favorite is Downcast. Well, thanks so much for listening, and have a great rest of the week.